Emily Carter stepped into Bright Hope Medical Center, the familiar scent of antiseptic filling her nostrils. The automatic doors closed behind her, sealing off the outside world and plunging her into the controlled chaos of the hospital. As a temporary nurse, Emily had grown accustomed to the constant hum of activity, but anxiety still fluttered in her chest as she began each shift. She made her way to the locker room, her footsteps echoing in the sterile hallway. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders as she changed into her scrubs. Emily had always been drawn to nursing, driven by a desire to help others in their most vulnerable moments. But as a temp, she felt like an outsider, always having to prove herself anew. The bustling corridors were a maze of activity as Emily emerged. Doctors in white coats rushed past, their faces set in grim determination. Nurses pushed medication carts, their eyes darting between patient rooms and the charts in their hands. The constant beeping of monitors created a discordant symphony, a reminder of the lives hanging in the balance. Emily's temporary status meant she was often assigned to different departments, forcing her to adapt quickly to new protocols and unfamiliar faces. As she began her rounds, Emily felt a strange sense of foreboding, as if the air itself was charged with tension. She shook off the feeling, attributing it to her usual new shift jitters. Little did she know that this day would test her in ways she could never have imagined. Emily paused outside the first patient's room. The muffled sob that reached Emily's ears carried a weight that seemed to bend the very air around her. Emily's heart quickened as she moved towards the source of the sound, her footsteps echoing in the eerily quiet corridor. The noise grew louder as she approached room 237, and a sense of dread settled in her stomach. She paused outside the door, taking a deep breath to steady herself before gently pushing it open. The sight that greeted her made her breath catch in her throat. Mr. Harold Jenkins, an elderly man with skin the color of rich mahogany, lay crumpled in his bed. His thin frame shook with each sob, the hospital gown barely covering his frail body. Emily's eyes darted around the room, taking in the signs of neglect that seemed to scream at her from every corner. A tipped-over urine bottle lay on the floor, its contents seeping into the linoleum. The acrid smell mingled with the sterile hospital air, creating a nauseating cocktail. Mr. Jenkins's gown was stained yellow, a clear indication that it hadn't been changed in far too long. The call button lay just out of his reach, as if mocking his helplessness. Emily's training kicked in, and she rushed to Mr. Jenkins's side. His skin felt clammy to the touch, and his eyes, when they finally met hers, were filled with a mixture of relief and lingering fear.
"Thank God,"
he whispered, his voice hoarse from crying.
"I thought everyone had forgotten about me."
As Emily began to assess his condition, her mind raced through the checklist of neglect signs she'd learned about, but never expected to encounter so blatantly. Dehydration, possible bed sores, signs of malnutrition. Each revelation felt like a physical blow. How long had Mr. Jenkins been left in this state?
"Mr. Jenkins,"
Emily said softly, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice.
"I'm so sorry. Can you tell me what happened? How long have you been feeling this way?"
The old man's eyes welled up with fresh tears.
"It's been days,"
he croaked.
"I've been telling them I'm in pain, that something's not right. But that doctor, Dr. Grant, she just looks at me like I'm making it up."
He gripped Emily's hand suddenly, his gaze intense.
"I may be old, nurse, but I'm not senile. I know when I'm being ignored."
Emily felt a chill run down her spine.
"Why do you think Dr. Grant is ignoring your concerns?"
The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. When Mr. Jenkins finally spoke, his words were barely above a whisper, but they rang in Emily's ears like a thunderclap.
"Because of this,"
he said, gesturing to his dark skin.
"She looks at me, and all she sees is an old black man who doesn't know what he's talking about."
The weight of his accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Emily's mind reeled as she tried to process the implications. Could it be true? Was racial bias affecting patient care right here, right now, in Bright Hope Medical Center? As she looked at Mr. Jenkins, seeing the pain and resignation in his eyes, Emily felt something shift inside her. A fire ignited in her chest, a determination she'd never felt before. In that moment, she knew she wouldn't let this stand. But as the enormity of the situation dawned on her, fear crept in alongside her resolve. Speaking up could cost her this job, maybe even her career. Was she ready to risk everything for a patient she'd just met? As she adjusted Mr. Jenkins's pillows, her hands moving on autopilot, Emily's thoughts spiraled through the potential outcomes of speaking up. Her temporary status at the hospital suddenly felt more precarious than ever. Would anyone believe her over Dr. Grant, a respected physician with years of experience? The thought of being labeled a troublemaker, of losing her position and potentially her entire career, sent a chill down her spine. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. Her training had prepared her for medical emergencies, for split-second decisions that could save lives. But this moral quandary that pitted her professional ethics against self-preservation felt like uncharted territory. The words of her professor echoed in her memory.
As nurses, we are often the last line of defense for our patients. Our silence can be as harmful as any medical error.
Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her clipboard, her decision crystallizing with each passing moment. The risks were real, the potential fallout daunting. But as she looked at Mr. Jenkins, at the visible signs of neglect that no patient should ever endure, Emily knew she couldn't walk away. With a mixture of fear and determination, Emily began to document every detail of Mr. Jenkins's condition. As she wrote, her resolve strengthened. This was about upholding the very principles that had drawn her to nursing in the first place. Emily's heart pounded as she finished her notes. She tucked the clipboard under her arm, her jaw set with determination. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with potential pitfalls. But as Emily stepped out of Mr. Jenkins's room, preparing herself to confront Dr. Grant, she knew one thing for certain. She was ready to fight for what was right, whatever the cost. Emily approached Dr. Grant's office, her heart pounding in her chest. The hospital's usual buzz faded away, replaced by the thundering of her own pulse. She paused at the door, taking a deep breath before knocking.
Come in.
Dr. Grant's sharp voice called from inside. Emily entered, her fingers trembling as she gripped her clipboard. Dr. Grant sat behind her desk, her posture rigid and her eyes cold. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a scalpel.
Dr. Grant,
Emily began, her voice steadier than she felt.
I need to discuss Mr. Jenkins's care with you.
Dr. Grant's eyebrow arched.
Mr. Jenkins, the patient in 237? What about him?
Emily swallowed hard.
I've documented several instances of neglect in his care. His gown was soiled, his call button out of reach, and he's been complaining of severe pain that's gone unaddressed.
Dr. Grant's eyes narrowed.
Nurse Carter, isn't it? You're one of our TEMs, correct?
Her tone dripped with condescension.
I assure you, Mr. Jenkins is receiving appropriate care. Perhaps you're not familiar with our protocols here.
Emily felt her cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment, but she pressed on.
Dr. Grant, Mr. Jenkins believes his concerns are being dismissed because of his race. I can't ignore that.
The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Dr. Grant stood slowly, her body language screaming defensiveness.
Are you accusing me of racial bias, Nurse Carter?
Her voice was dangerously low.
I'm reporting what I've observed and what the patient has expressed.
Emily replied, fighting to keep her voice steady.
It's our duty to investigate any potential issues in patient care.
Dr. Grant's laugh was harsh.
Our duty? You're a temporary nurse. You have no idea of the complexities involved in running this department.
As their voices rose, Emily noticed movement in the hallway. Other staff members were slowing as they passed, curious eyes peering through the open door. The confrontation was becoming a spectacle, and Emily felt her resolve wavering under the weight of the attention. Dr. Grant noticed too, her eyes darting to the doorway, her voice lowered to a hiss.
Listen carefully, Nurse Carter. You're treading on very thin ice. Accusations like this can ruin careers. If you pursue this matter, I can guarantee your time at Bright Hope will be very short indeed. Do I make myself clear?
The threat hung in the air between them, heavy and ominous. Emily's mind raced, weighing the potential consequences of her actions against the oath she'd taken to protect her patients. In that moment, she saw two paths stretching out before her, one of safety and silence, the other fraught with danger, but paved with integrity. As she met Dr. Grant's cold gaze, Emily felt something crystallize within her. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a surge of determination. She straightened her spine, gripping her clipboard like a shield.
Crystal clear, Dr. Grant.
Emily replied, her voice steady and resolute.
I'll be taking this to the hospital administration immediately.
With that, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving a stunned Dr. Grant in her wake. Emily knew the storm was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever came next. Emily's heart raced as she hurried back to Mr. Jenkins's room, worry and determination swirling in her mind. The confrontation with Dr. Grant faded, replaced by a growing sense of dread. As she neared the door, an eerie silence sent chills down her spine. Pushing it open, Emily froze. Mr. Jenkins lay motionless, his skin ashen and clammy. Monitors beeped urgently, matching the panic rising in her chest. She rushed to his side, her trained hands assessing his vital signs.
Mr. Jenkins, can you hear me?
Emily called, her voice quavering. No response. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak. Emily's mind cycled through possible complications: dehydration, infection, organ failure, each more dire than the last. She pressed the call button repeatedly.
I need help in here.
She shouted down the hallway. While waiting for backup, Emily worked to stabilize Mr. Jenkins, adjusting his oxygen and checking his IV lines. The room filled with activity as nurses and a resident arrived. Emily relayed Mr. Jenkins's status, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. She watched helplessly as they worked, anger rising at how quickly things had deteriorated. As they fought to stabilize him, Emily recalled her research on delayed care consequences, increased mortality, longer hospital stays, preventable complications. The statistics now had a face in the frail man before her. Minutes crawled by. Finally, Mr. Jenkins's condition improved, his vitals inching towards normal. Emily exhaled deeply, relief washing over her. As the crisis passed, a new urgency took hold. This was about a systemic failure, about other vulnerable patients at risk. Emily knew she couldn't wait. With a final glance at Mr. Jenkins, now resting easier, Emily made her decision. She strode out, steps purposeful. The path to administration stretched before her. She thought of Mr. Jenkins's pain and fear, of Dr. Grant's dismissive threats. Most of all, she remembered her oath to advocate for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The sterile quiet of the administrative office pressed in on Emily as she stood before the desk, her fingers clutching the phone. The weight of her decision settled heavily on her shoulders. Breaking protocol meant exposing the hospital's hidden secrets. Emily's heart pounded as she dialed the number, each ring echoing in her ears. When the administrator's voice answered, crisp and professional, Emily felt a sudden urge to hang up. But the image of Mr. Jenkins, frail and neglected, flashed in her mind, stealing her resolve.
This is Nurse Emily Carter,
She began, her voice steadier than she felt.
I need to report a serious case of patient neglect and possible discrimination.
The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. A pause, then a carefully measured response.
That's a very serious accusation, Nurse Carter. Do you have any evidence to support your claims?
Emily's frustration bubbled up. Of course they would question her. She was just a temporary nurse after all, but she had come prepared.
Yes, sir. I have detailed documentation of Mr. Jenkins's condition, including time-stamped notes and photographs. I've also recorded his own statement regarding his treatment by Dr. Grant.
I see. And you've discussed this with Dr. Grant directly?
Emily's grip on the phone tightened.
I tried, sir, but she dismissed my concerns and
She hesitated, then plunged ahead.
she implied that pursuing this matter could jeopardize my position here.
The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Emily's mind raced, imagining the administrator simply hanging up, dismissing her concerns as the ramblings of an overzealous temp. But then he spoke, his tone carefully neutral.
That's a very serious allegation, Nurse Carter. I'll need to see all of your evidence immediately.
Relief washed over Emily, quickly tempered by a new wave of anxiety.
Of course, sir. I can bring everything to your office right away.
As Emily laid out her evidence before the administrator, she could see the gravity of the situation slowly dawning on him. His eyes widened as he flipped through her meticulous notes, his brow furrowing as he examined the photos of Mr. Jenkins's neglected state.
This is concerning.
He said finally, looking up at Emily with a mix of disbelief and grudging respect.
I'll need to launch a full investigation immediately.
Emily nodded, a complex mix of emotions swirling within her. Relief that she was being taken seriously, fear of the repercussions, and a fierce determination to see this through. As she left the office, she could already feel the ripples of her actions spreading through the hospital. Whispers followed her down the hallway, curious glances from nurses and doctors who sensed that something big was happening. She felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. Whatever happened next, she knew she had done the right thing, and that knowledge would carry her through the challenges ahead. Emily stepped back onto the hospital floor, an eerie calm settling over the normally bustling corridors. The air felt thick with tension, as if everyone was holding their breath.
Some colleagues met her eyes with admiration, while others averted their gaze, faces a mix of fear and uncertainty.
Her heart raced as she made her way to the nurse's station, hyper-aware of every glance and hushed conversation. The weight of her actions pressed down on her shoulders, the enormity of what she had set in motion finally sinking in. The investigation into Dr. Grant's conduct had begun, and ripples were spreading throughout Bright Hope Medical Center. Every time she entered a patient's room or reached for a chart, she half expected someone to confront her, to demand answers or hurl accusations. But the confrontation never came. Instead, there was just this suffocating silence, broken only by the beeping of monitors and the occasional squeak of shoes on linoleum. Emily's mind raced as she tried to focus on her tasks. She found herself constantly checking the time, wondering how long it would take for news about Mr. Jenkins's condition to reach her. The wait was agonizing, each minute stretching out like an hour. She longed to rush to his room, to see for herself that he was improving, but she knew she couldn't draw any more attention to the situation. As the day wore on, Emily began to notice subtle shifts in the atmosphere. A nurse named Sarah caught her eye across the hallway and gave her a small, encouraging smile. Later, an orderly named Mike whispered a quick, "You did the right thing," as he passed her in the medication room. These small gestures of support were like lifelines, helping Emily keep her head above water in the sea of uncertainty she found herself in. But not everyone was on her side. She overheard snippets of conversation in the break room, voices tinged with skepticism and fear.
Who does she think she is? Stirring up trouble?
One voice hissed.
We'll all be under the microscope now.
Another replied. As Emily finally clocked out, exhausted both physically and emotionally, she realized that her actions had sparked more than just an investigation. They had cracked open the facade of the hospital, revealing the complex web of relationships, fears, and long-buried truths that lay beneath the surface. Emily stepped out of Bright Hope Medical Center, her eyes widening at the scene before her. A sea of faces stretched across the hospital grounds, their voices rising in unison. Colorful signs bobbed above the crowd, demanding justice and change. The air crackled with energy, a stark contrast to the sterile quiet of the hospital corridors. Her heart raced as she took in the sight. Families of patients stood shoulder to shoulder with community activists, their faces etched with determination. Local news crews jostled for position, cameras trained on the growing throng. The crowd's chants echoed off the hospital's brick facade, impossible to ignore. No more bias, equal care for all. In the days that followed, Emily found herself at the center of a media storm. Her phone buzzed constantly with interview requests and messages of support. Local newspapers ran front-page stories detailing the discrimination Mr. Jenkins had faced, each article fanning the flames of public outrage. As public pressure mounted, Bright Hope's administration found itself backed into a corner. Emergency board meetings stretched late into the night as they grappled with the crisis. Emily caught glimpses of harried executives rushing through the halls, their faces drawn with stress. As weeks passed, rumors began to circulate about a major announcement from Bright Hope. Emily's nerves were on edge as she reported for her shift, the air thick with anticipation. She couldn't help but wonder what changes were coming and how they would affect her future at the hospital. As she made her way to the nurse's station, new posters caught her eye. "Patient rights are human rights," one proclaimed in bold letters. Another asked, "Have you witnessed discrimination? Speak up." A shiver ran down her spine. Had her act of courage truly sparked this movement? Throughout the day, Emily overheard snippets of conversation that made her breath catch. "They're forming a task force," one nurse whispered excitedly, "to address racial bias and patient neglect." Emily's heart swelled with a mix of pride and trepidation. The implications were far-reaching. In the break room, Dr. Simmons, the head of internal medicine, cornered Emily. His normally stern face was etched with concern.
"The board is in an uproar, Nurse Carter,"
he said, his voice low.
"Some want to sweep this under the rug. Others are pushing for a complete overhaul of our policies."
Emily's stomach churned at his words, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. As the day drew to a close, an announcement crackled over the intercom. "All staff report to the auditorium at 5 p.m. for an important meeting." Emily's pulse quickened. This was the moment of truth. Would her actions lead to real change, or would they be dismissed? The auditorium buzzed with nervous energy as Emily took her seat. She felt the eyes of her colleagues on her, some filled with hope, others with resentment. The hospital administrator, Mr. Thornton, stepped up to the podium, his face grave.
"As you all know, serious allegations have been made regarding patient care at Bright Hope,"
he began. Emily's heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Mr. Thornton's next words sent a collective gasp through the room.
"Dr. Lisa Grant has been suspended pending further investigation."
Emily's vision blurred, relief and shock washing over her. But it was his next statement that truly took her breath away.
"Furthermore, we are implementing mandatory bias training for all staff and forming a patient advocacy committee to address concerns of discrimination and neglect."
As the meeting adjourned, Emily found herself swept up in a tide of emotions. Joy at the vindication of her actions warred with anxiety about the uncertain future ahead. She thought of Mr. Jenkins, now receiving the care he deserved, and felt a surge of pride. But as she made her way out of the auditorium, the weight of her colleagues' stares heavy on her back, Emily couldn't help but wonder, what storms still lay ahead in the fight for true equality in healthcare? The echoes of applause faded, replaced by a deafening silence that followed Emily like a shadow. Her mind raced with the potential consequences of her actions. Had she sacrificed her entire career for one moment of moral courage? The harsh fluorescent lights cast a sickly glow over the room, making everything feel surreal and distant. Her fingers traced the edge of her phone, tempted to check for messages or missed calls. Her stomach churned at the possibilities. A call from her temp agency, informing her that her services were no longer required? Or worse, a lawyer warning her of impending legal action? The weight of her decision pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had stood up for what was right, had given voice to the voiceless. The thought of never again wearing scrubs, never again being able to comfort a patient in their darkest hour, sent a shiver down her spine. She thought of her family, of the pride in her mother's eyes when she had graduated nursing school. What would they say now? Would they understand the choice she had made? Or would they see it as a reckless act of self-sabotage? The emotional toll of the past week crashed over Emily like a tidal wave. The hospital that had once felt like a beacon of hope now seemed tainted, its corridors filled with shadows of doubt and mistrust. Could she walk these halls day after day, facing the consequences of her actions? Perhaps it was time to move on, to find a fresh start somewhere untouched by controversy. But the thought of running away, of abandoning the fight she had started, made her heart ache. Suddenly, Emily's phone buzzed, startling her out of her reverie. Her heart raced as she fumbled to answer it, her mind bracing for the worst. But the voice on the other end wasn't angry or accusatory. It was warm.
Nurse Carter, this is Dr. Michaels from the hospital board. I wanted to personally commend you for your bravery in coming forward. Your actions have sparked a much-needed change at Bright Hope.
Emily's breath caught in her throat, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. As Dr. Michaels continued, praising her integrity and assuring her of the board's full support, Emily felt something shift within her. The weight on her shoulders didn't disappear, but it became lighter, more manageable. As she ended the call, Emily stood up, her posture straighter, her chin lifted. Armed with the knowledge that her actions had made a real difference, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. Bright Hope Medical Center pulsed with a newfound energy, its corridors alive with the legacy of Emily's courage. Her journey from temporary staff to reformer had transformed the institution and the lives it touched. Her legacy was more than policies changed. It was a spirit of compassion and resilience that would continue to shape lives long after she'd gone. Click on the video to the right to follow Jamal Rivers' journey. He's a young delivery driver whose concern for his elderly neighbor leads him to rally an entire community to support her. Or click on the video to the left for a gripping tale that unfolds in a nursing home. Mrs. Jenkins finds herself the target of a nurse's hidden cruelty.